This festive season, make sure you stock up on Ring devices, which range from video doorbells to alarm and cameras. These easy-to-install smart home security products will give you peace of mind while you're away, as you can see, hear and talk to visitors from anywhere. Ring's products are available at Takealot, Builders Warehouse, Incredible Connection, Vodacom and Leroy Merlin, because with Ring, you're always home. Welcome to True Crime South Africa. I'm Nicole Engelbrecht, and you're listening to the next bonus episode in a series of bonuses I'm releasing this December to thank you, True Crime South Africa listeners, for your amazing support throughout the year. I've had the privilege of being able to interview some pretty incredible people this year, thanks to the lovely folks over at CBS Justice. All of these interviews have been included at the end of full case episodes. So I thought, in case you missed them, or even if you didn't, I'd put them into an omnibus of sorts for you to enjoy. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd have the honor of chatting with international crime fighters like Dr. Richard Shepherd or the incredible Jackie Moulton. So a huge thank you goes out to CBS Justice for their support this year, as well as making these interviews happen. So let's get into it. Dr. Richard Shepherd. As I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, I had the absolute pleasure of interviewing Dr. Richard Shepherd, one of the world's leading forensic pathologists who's performed more than 23,000 autopsies. Dr. Shepherd worked on some very high-profile cases, including the Hungerford Massacre, the death of Princess Diana, and the inquiry into the serial killer Harold Shipman. He's also an author and the host of the brand new CBS Justice original series, The Truth About My Murder. With this case having shown the power of the forensic pathologist in revealing the truth about Lucky's murder, I thought it apt to have my interview with Dr. Shepherd placed here. So here's my chat with Dr. Richard Shepherd. Dr. Shepherd is uniquely placed, considering his long tenure as a forensic pathologist, as to have seen the development of the science. He mentioned in one interview I listened to that when he started working as a pathologist, the rules on scenes were simply put your hands in your pockets and don't leave fingerprints. And today that is very different. I asked Dr. Shepherd what his experience had been of how the science of forensic medicine has changed from when he first started practicing until he retired.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things here. There's the forensic pathology, which in a sense, the body hasn't changed, so how we examine it really hasn't changed much until the last few years, but I'll come to that. Forensic science has changed beyond all recognition. And so the examination of the scene and the body looking for what we call trace evidence. These are, hairs and blood spots and fibers, soil samples, pollen. All of these things have become so important in the investigation of a serious offense, whether it's a murder or anything else. And as a result, the people that go to look at the body, go to the scene, have to protect the scene from themselves. They're not protecting themselves from the scene. This is why they wear the white suits, they have gloves on, they have masks, and all of these things when I first started out were just not important, because forensic science, they could detect fingerprints and it would cost me a bottle of whiskey if anyone ever found one of my fingerprints at the scene. So I was determined that didn't happen, but that was the real concern. We were more concerned about protecting ourselves against blood and infections from the scene. Now it's turned around. But forensic science is so powerful now. we have to be very careful. Forensic medicine, as I say, hasn't changed a lot until now. The development of CT scans and MRI scans, which have really allowed us to investigate the body before we even start the post-mortem. And that's been a huge step forward.
I thought it was quite important that Dr. Shepherd had pointed out the distinction between forensic science and forensic medicine, because they really are two very different things.
Yes. I mean, they run parallel, but we've been through a phase where forensic science has developed and changed so much. But as I say, the human body stayed pretty static. So, we have a good system for examining it. Why change it if it's not broke?
Dr. Shepherd mentions scans that are now used in autopsies. And when you watch the series The Truth About My Murder, you'll see Dr. Shepherd uses digital autopsy tools to show viewers how pathologists would have helped solve the cases being discussed. There are a few facilities in the UK that have this technology, but in my research I also noted that there was a bit of pushback against it. I asked Dr. Shepherd what his experience has been of the technology and if he thinks it will one day completely take over from physical autopsies.
No, I think it is. Using CT scans is something that's happened in particular in Melbourne in Australia, the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, for decades now. And it's a really useful tool, but it has to be used in the correct way. It's used there and now increasingly in the UK and America and other places too, to try and understand why someone has died from natural causes. So we're not talking about accidents. We're not talking about murders. We're talking about being able to make a decision to say, we do not need to do an autopsy on this body because we have the results. Let me take a simple example. The aorta, the main blood vessel of the body, as you get older, it can get weakened. It can develop an aneurysm, which can burst, and that can cause a sudden death. And that can easily be seen on a CT scan. And so we can save the family distress. We can save work for the mortuary staff if we can see that. And it allows a diversion of that body away from having a full autopsy. So it can be really useful for that. But some forensic pathologists, some pathologists don't like it because they think the radiologists are muscling in on their field, which clearly isn't true. But in terms of accidents, in terms of murders, in terms of trauma, it is a fantastically powerful technique to be able to monitor, to document, to get data, even before we start the post-mortem. So it can give us the guide, the help. And on that area, the forensic area, the suspicious death, the murder, it is so powerful and so helpful.
I asked Dr. Shepherd whether, to his knowledge, there'd been any issue with courts accepting digital autopsy evidence in criminal cases.
And none that I'm aware of. I think because it is a well-established in clinical medicine, it is so well-established how the data is saved, how it's recorded, how it's transferred is well. So I'm sure there will come a challenge, if you see what I mean, because that's what happens when there's the interface between medicine and the law. There will come a challenge, I'm sure. But at the moment, it's been proven to be so useful. I mean, we had in England, there was a case a while ago of a man who was found injured by the side of the road, and it was thought that a truck had gone past and hit his head with the wing mirror of the thing. No one took a lot of notice. He went into the hospital. He had a surgical operation that removed the damaged bit of skull, and then he died. And then it became clear that actually it wasn't a truck. He'd been hit with a hammer. But by that time, the bit of skull had been thrown away. But from the CT scan, they were able to recover that data, and using 3D printing, they were able to make the bit of skull and use that bit of evidence in court to convict someone. So, it has a power far beyond anything that we can perhaps even think of now.
How amazing is that story? In other interviews I listened to with Dr. Shepherd, he'd spoken about the autopsies he'd done which ended up being the victims of serial murderers. Forensic pathologists are often uniquely placed to see the similarities in cases and identify those. I asked Dr. Shepherd if he could explain how he may have experienced the similarities and progression in these post-mortems of the victims of serial murderers.
I mean, I've not been involved directly in many, but the one I have been involved in is the case of a lady called Rachel Nickell, who was murdered on in a park area in South London when she was out walking with her young son. I think he was less than 2 years old. She was stabbed multiple times, but it was only later on that I was examining the body of someone else, and I said, this is so similar. It's a young woman with a child, only this time in a house with a child, who both of them had been murdered. And I said, this is so similar. There needs to be a link, because the murder of Rachel was so unusual. No murder is routine, but there are patterns that you see time and time again. And remember, you're much more likely to be murdered by a member of your family or a relative than anyone else in the world. So, look at that carefully when you go home tonight. But it is, this is just so unusual. A young woman stabbed to death in a parkland area. And it's these unusual cases. So the linking in, but of course, serial killers change. Serial killers alter what they do. They discover that they got enjoyment out of that bit of the murder, but they didn't get enjoyment out of the other bit of the murder. And so it changes. And spotting that can sometimes be easy, can sometimes be hard.
I was very interested to discover that Dr. Shepherd was involved in the inquiry conducted into the serial murders committed by another more infamous doctor, Dr. Harold Shipman. Shipman, of course, is believed to have been the most prolific serial killer of all time. He was a medical doctor who murdered an estimated 250 of his most elderly patients, in many cases defrauding the victims by changing their wills or stealing from them in some other way before injecting them with deadly substances. I asked Dr. Shepherd whether he could tell us about his involvement in that case.
I mean, in English law, there's the prosecution and the defense will almost always employ a pathologist to advise them. And that was my role with Harold Shipman. I acted not as the prosecution pathologist, but as the defense pathologist. So I got to see many of the postmortems, and I got to understand a lot of what was going on.
The consultant work is a lot of what's been keeping Dr. Shepherd busy since he officially retired from work as a forensic pathologist.
There's a finite line, I think, when you stop working on a very regular basis, a day-by-day basis. I think I'm conscious that I have to be aware of skill fade if I'm not doing it all the time. And now it is a number of years since I stopped doing full-time work. And so I'm doing less and less advice, working for the defense, advising coroners, advising governments and things like that. But it is less, because I have so much more interesting things to do, like flying my planes and keeping my bees, which is much more fun and less stressful. Nobody shouts at me when I'm doing them.
Dr. Shepherd has worked on many high-profile cases, but in another interview I listened to, he said that the most interesting cases he's worked on are actually not the most high-profile ones. I asked him which cases do stand out to him as the most interesting of his career.
The high profile ones are always interesting because there's lots going on, but often pathologically they are not the most difficult. When you have a pop star or an actress or an actor dead in a hotel that's pretty sure it's going to be drugs and alcohol, the story of why they did it is much more sad and interesting than how they did it. It's difficult to pinpoint one case. I mean, I talk in my first book, Unnatural Causes, about the case of a girl called Alana who died from epilepsy, died suddenly, and for her parents' point of view anyway, surprisingly, overnight from epilepsy. And I think those cases are interesting because the diagnosis was a bit difficult. It was a bit unusual, but also talking to her parents, I was able to explain to them what had happened and how it had happened. And I hope give them an understanding that would enable them to begin a really difficult journey of coming to terms with the loss of their young daughter. And so they say that, you know, the fascinating cases are often these quiet ones where I've sat in a room with, you know, a wife or a son or a mum and a dad, and we've talked about what's gone on. I've learnt about what they thought about their relative, you know, but I hope I've given them, with compassion, that ability to begin to move on. I can't take them through grieving, but I can at least help them to start the grieving with certain knowledge. And it's always true in medicine that the fantasies people have are 99.9% worse than the reality of what actually happened. And so rooting them, grounding them in the reality can be quite hard, but it's a far better place to start that process of grieving.
I said to Dr. Shepherd, as I have to the other forensic pathologists I've interviewed, that I think that this is almost one of the most important parts of their work. It's being able to gift that truth to a grieving family, because without it, their grief may be complicated and far more difficult to work through.
I've always said that, I mean, truth becomes philosophically a slightly fuzzy subject when you go to court. What is the truth in court? Remember, you know, with an adversarial system, you have two truths and you have to sort of, well, I don't have to decide, I just have to work between the two. But it is, you know, being honest and decent to the best of your ability is the closest that you can get, I think, to the truth.
Having interviewed two South African forensic pathologists on the podcast, Dr. Herstel van Staden and Dr. Ryan Blumenthal, and now speaking to Dr. Shepherd with a different geographical perspective, I wanted to get a feel for how the UK environment is different from South Africa. In the UK, for instance, would a pathologist visit the scene of each unnatural death, and how common is it for detectives in suspected murder cases to attend an autopsy?
No, a pathologist wouldn't necessarily attend all unnatural deaths. The police will, and the level of their skills is a bit variable. Sometimes, of course, they're young police officers, sometimes they're rather older sergeants or inspectors, and so the interpretation and understanding can be different. A pathologist will often, but once again not always, go to the scene of a suspected murder. You know, sometimes the paramedics have arrived, the body is gone, there's not a lot necessarily to see at that time. I mean, my view was the pathologist should always go to the scene, but you don't necessarily have to go before you do the post-mortem. You can often go after the post-mortem when you can move around more easily. You don't have to wear so much protective gear. You can see relationships and things of that sort. In terms of police officers attending potential murders post-mortems, yes, there's a very definite attendance. As a group of people, we'll have a photographer, we'll have a crime scene investigator, we'll probably have an exhibits officer, we'll probably have the senior investigating officer, and maybe other people as well. So there's quite a core group of people who will attend the post-mortem to see that.
And that is, of course, something we know we struggle with in South Africa, and it's been pointed out as being a major problem. I said to Dr. Shepherd that it seems really important for a detective to be there, to have that feedback loop of information going.
And it's sort of constant going on. You know, the detective will be talking on his phone and he'll say, we've heard this, or I'll say, well, I found some injuries. I really think when you're at the scene or near the scene, you should be telling your officers to look for a hammer or a knife. Or, you know, so there's this exchange of information the whole time, which can be really, really useful in moving the process on.
Interestingly, I did ask Dr. Shepherd whether he thought that sufficient resources would be available to cover all cases if a pathologist did need to attend all unnatural deaths in the United Kingdom. And he said, absolutely not. There would simply be far too many for their resources to support something like that.
We need a sort of a stepladder approach here. You know, the junior police officer will go to the scene, and then they won't be happy, so they'll call their sergeant, he'll call his inspector, and then it will work its way up. unless, of course, there's obvious sounds of gunfire and there's someone dead on the street with bullet holes in them, then it's, it's sort of obvious. But if a body is found in a house, it can take a while, and it often depends on the skill and experience of the people that go there. And certainly I've had cases where someone said, there's nothing that's worrying. And when I start the post-mortem, it's clear that there obviously is. And, maybe had I or someone more experienced gone to the scene, we would have seen that at the time. But that's training, that's skills and experience. And you can't criticize someone for not having had 40 years experience.
In one of the episodes of The Truth About My Murder that I watched, which was about the murder of Peter Farker, Dr. Shepherd mentions that in an autopsy, something may be identified as a cause of death, but it may not be the cause of death. So I asked him to explain the difference between those two concepts.
Whenever you do a post-mortem examination, there are a number of things may be obvious. Peter Farker, I think, he was found lying next to a bottle of whiskey, and, he smelt of whiskey, and he was said by his partner to be an alcoholic, and he'd found him like this. And so, there's lots of arrows pointing in one direction. And as a result, you can easily get led away down that track. In fact, that's probably not what happened to him. He was poisoned with other drugs that he'd been given. But if you're not thinking broadly, you have to be wary of being trapped. And it's all too easy to go down the easy route. I mean, I'm also doing a tour around the United Kingdom again, second time this year. And part of that tour is talking about how you look at the crime scene. And the words I use are think dirty. You have to think dirty. So even if it looks nice, the house is nice and tidy, everything's neat and straight, is that what it should be like? Or has someone tied it up? The body's in the bed. Have the body been moved? Has it been changed? Has it been altered? Have things been hidden away? All of these things have to go through your mind, but they can only go through your mind once you have the skills and the experience to be able to step back and think of them. So certainly it's true that, if you seize upon the simple thing, you might miss something that's far more important.
Dr. Shepherd has worked on several mass murder incidents, including the Hungerford massacre and the Bali bombings. I asked him how scenes like that with multiple fatalities are different, if at all, from cases of single fatalities, perhaps in the way he would approach them or the challenges involved.
Well, they're all so different. Hungerford was a number of people, but they were separated, they were interspersed, and in a sense it was also known how it was likely that each person was going to have died. So they were all different, but they were in a similar group, and they were sort of separate from each other. And so in terms of examining the scenes, it was possible to pick one at a time and move around and do the postmortems one at a time to get the individual bits of information. With something like a bomb blast or a plane crash or things of that sort, you get lots of mingling, you get lots of things happening all together, you get fire, you get large amounts of force and energy used, and fragmentation. And world trade is perhaps the best example or worst example of that. And so managing those scenes is very different. In a bombing scene, if it's, when we managed the London bombings, there were 4 separate ones, but multiple fatalities at each. And it's a question of following it through in a careful progression, not rushing in. Once there is certainty that there is no one alive at the scene that requires help, then I always say, slightly jokingly, right, stop, go away and have a cup of tea and plan. Okay, we always have plans. We have plans that are made out of, in books that we can use for resilience. But let's go away, stop and think, because every single case is slightly different, and you don't want to miss by rushing in and just following the protocol, bang, 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 missing something that on this case is unusual. And when in the London bombings, what was unusual was there was a lot of blue plastic. That was it. Nothing
Right.
terribly exciting. Lots of people dead, but the key thing was there was lots of blue plastic, and it was present in each of the 4 scenes. And that was the forensic science clue. Pathologically, it didn't mean a lot, other than we identified it and were able to follow that through. And that turned out to be obviously part of the wrapping, and where the wrapping had come from and who had handled it and were their fingerprints on it all became crucial. So managing mass disaster scenes is a real skill. And we can also look at maybe Yugoslavia. We can look at what will come in Ukraine. In the future, we can look at the tsunami. How you manage these things, it just takes skill and patience, and my goodness me, a lot of courage for the people that go in and do them as well.
And of course, in scenes where there's significant dismemberment of bodies, like the World Trade Center attacks, there's also the requirement that pieces of bodies need to be identified by DNA to actually, sadly, reassemble a human being from what's left.
World Trade, there were a number of quite well-preserved bodies, but the vast majority was so fragmented by the forces of the collapse of the buildings, more than the forces of the planes hitting the buildings. The forces of the collapse of the buildings were so massive that we were talking 30, 40,000 fragments of human, that some could not be positively identified by DNA. And I think I read recently that there are still about, give or take, 1,500 people who no part of them has ever been recovered from World Trade. So that's 1,500 families where there's not even a fragment that can be positively identified. And they are now at the point where they do have quite a lot of tissue samples left, but these tissue samples are so contaminated, so small, that were they to analyze them, there would be nothing left at the end of it. Yeah. And there's, once again, at this stage, do you want to go through that? I mean, do you want to say to someone, well, yes, actually, we've now found one tiny fragment of your husband, but it's no longer there, so there's nothing we can do with it. It's a real issue and a problem, and this is where the compassion of forensic pathology has to come in, and the care for the courts, but the care for the families and the relatives, that has to go through what we do into how we communicate.
Dr. Shepherd's field of specialisation is knife-related incidents, and I wondered whether that's because knife-related incidents are so common in the UK, or is it just a cause of death he finds particularly interesting from a medical point of view?
Common things occur commonly. And so, in the UK, after Hungerford, after Dunblane shooting, with the IRA, with the ownership and the use of guns is incredibly restricted. And so gun-related crime is very, very minor part of the forensic pathologist's work. Whereas knife wounds, with a gun, you can stand 100, 200 yards away, a mile away. I mean, if you're an American Forces sniper, it's a kilometer away or whatever. You don't need to get close. But with a knife, you actually have to be up close. You have to be within touching distance of that person. And that alters the dynamics and the psychology of what's going on. And knives are ubiquitous. Knives are all through the community. And I've seen so many cases of minor fights that have ended in the death of someone, just a fragment of a second of anger, a knife in someone's hand, and they're dead. And I slightly jokingly say that this is one of the design faults that I found with the human body, that most of us are right-handed, 85% or so right-handed. The heart is on the left-hand side 99.9% of the time. And so a right-handed person with a knife, if they stab someone in front of them, there's a significant chance it's going to go through the heart. And then it's just chance. I've seen lots of people who've lived by a millimeter, and I've seen far, far, far too many people who've died because that millimeter has been the wrong side. It's cut a major blood vessel, it's cut into the heart, it's done something awful, and they've died. And knife crime is a real epidemic in this country. And we speak today when there has been the first spree stabbing in the world that I'm aware of in Canada.
On the day that I interviewed Dr. Shepherd, One of the world's first mass fatality stabbing incidents had just taken place in Canada. Of course, mass murders with short-bladed weapons are incredibly rare because the possibility that the offender will be disarmed is high. In this case, it appears that there were two offenders, and sadly, many lost their lives in that incident. My final question for Dr. Shepherd was about the international cases he's worked on, the Bali bombings, for instance, or the work he did on 9/11. I wondered how he found the experience of working in other countries.
It was, well, I'd done some work in Bermuda, which has got excellent facilities, a wonderful sort of hospital. I went out to Nigeria following the death of a man called Chief Abiola. I was sent out with a United Nations team. All of the local hospitals refused to let us perform an examination in their facilities for political, possibly, I don't know, for whatever reasons. And so we ended up performing the post-mortem in the operating theatre of a small private hospital. So, you know, you work with what you have. You know, it's not always ideal, but if you wait for the ideal in situations like this, it's never ever going to happen.
Professor Paul Britton. I had the pleasure of interviewing Professor Paul Britton. Professor Britton is considered to be the pioneer of criminal profiling in the UK. He's an expert criminal profiler, having spent more than 20 years working as a consultant, clinical and forensic psychologist, as well as being the former head of the Regional Forensic Psychology Service for Trent. He previously advised the Home Office and Association of Chief Police Officers Crime Committee on offender profiling and currently teaches clinical and forensic psychology at Birmingham City University. I could have picked Professor Britton's brain for days on end about many different cases, but the topic of our discussion for this interview was the CBS original documentary he's a part of called The Murder That Changed Britain. The documentary is truly incredible, and as far as I'm concerned, the learnings from it should really be applied to all legal systems around the world. The crux of the documentary is the investigation of a murder that happened in the UK in the early 90s. Rachel Nickel was walking on Wimbledon Common with her 2-year-old son when she was sexually assaulted and stabbed 49 times. She died from her injuries, and coincidentally, you would have heard me mention this case in the interview I did with Dr. Richard Shepherd, the British forensic pathologist who did the autopsy on another victim that would eventually be linked to Rachel's murder. That linkage, however, would only come after huge amounts of bungling from the British police, which led to the entrapment, arrest and charging of an innocent man in relation to Rachel's murder. Professor Britton was unwittingly drawn into this bungled investigation, and for the first time in the CBS documentary, he tells the truth behind this miscarriage of justice, which for decades has been framed as his responsibility. The documentary is absolutely fascinating and I highly recommend it. So without further ado, let's get into my interview with Professor Paul Britton. You've had an incredibly long and esteemed career in various roles as a forensic psychologist, and you're perhaps uniquely placed to have observed how the understanding of psychologically motivated crimes has changed over the years. What are some of the major changes you've seen in terms of how law enforcement and perhaps the public view such crimes and offenders now, as opposed to in the 1980s, when you were just introducing criminal profiling to the United Kingdom?
That's an interesting question. When I first was asked to help the police, at that stage, it was necessary to help them to understand the psychological basis of motivation of these sorts of perpetrators, of the victims as well. And an important part of helping them to move forward was putting that in very plain language and almost holding hands through interview processes. Now, I was fortunate enough to be asked to go to the Police Staff College at Bramshill from time to time, and that education has now seeped in. So we're now in a position where psychological insight is going into the police service, into the detective service, really from the beginning. And I think that's important. As far as the general public are concerned, I think it's slightly different. I think that from the contact I have had, very often people do want to understand what it is that's happened. And there is a change that I think is important. In the beginning, the focus was very much on the perpetrator, understanding and catching the perpetrator. Now, in the way that I work, understanding the perpetrator begins with understanding the victim, knowing the victim, understanding why was this victim, if it's a woman, why was she chosen? What made her special to this perpetrator? And I think it's the focus on the victim now that has become so much more important over the years with the public. And I think that is connected with, I'm not saying it's a part of why it happened, but it's certainly part of the growth of seeing women as more than just straw figures. I was fortunate enough years ago to have an award. And I remember saying on stage to the assembled body of writers and all of the rest of it, please don't show your victims as straw people, because so very often they were simply the vehicle for us to meet this terrible offender. And for me, the world goes the other way around. I have to know, and the people are now much more concerned with understanding the victim. So very often it's a lady, a woman of one age or another. And I think the more you come to know them, the easier, the more important it is, not just to know the offender, but to set the motivational drive running that helps you to locate and take them into custody.
I don't think I need to tell you that my brain started doing backflips as Professor Britton was answering this question and bringing across this concept of not having victims, and particularly women, seen as straw people or the straw man. This term is often used in a legal sense, but it's also used in other contexts, and it basically means an empty persona that's created for no other reason than to hold space or to allow the movement of other parts of a story. And I think for a long time in the press and the true crime content creation community, this is exactly what victims were. They were simply just present or mentioned in order to introduce the person the media or creator really wanted to talk about, the perpetrator. I do think this is changing. And I mentioned to Professor Britton that True Crime South Africa is victim-focused, and he was very pleased about that. Now, back to the interview. Firstly, I want to say that I think The Murder That Changed Britain is an incredibly important documentary, not just to the UK, but across the world. The concept of profiling is, of course, an important feature in the documentary. Could you maybe give listeners an idea of what a criminal profile is and how it should be used as a tool?
Well, for me, remember, my origins are as a clinician. So I'm a National Health Service clinical psychologist by origin. And before that, I'm a psychologist trained in the university system. So it begins with the police saying, can you help us with this murder? We're stuck. And so I come then as a clinician to look at what's happened. And there were 5 key questions for me. Questions are simple, answers not so. First question was, what has happened? It sounds very easy. The problem is that people jump to the wrong conclusions early on. And so they believe that A has happened, that it's a murder where someone was let in, but in fact it wasn't. It turns out to have been a true murder, but that the person gained entry in another method. And that's important. Then I want to know how. How was it done? What's the method? And in fine detail, and this again, When I teach psychologists in this area, I have to tell them you must be brave, because so often you have to go against the tide. I remember sitting in a room of experts. I was the only psychologist, and the opinion was that there were two offenders who had carried out this terrible assault and murder of a young girl. And when I went, I could not see two. I could only find evidence for one, and a local one at that, completely running against all the other view. Now, the pressure was to think, stay quiet, you'll pick it up as you go along. But you can't do that. So you have to put forward what you've seen, what your professional opinion is. Remember, you may have a killer out there who's going to come again. And if you don't do your job properly, then it'll continue. The senior investigating officer took the view, all right, everyone, please go back to the beginning. Everyone do their work all over again. We'll meet again in a few days and see where we are. Now, when we came back, it turned out that each of the other areas of specialist opinion had changed their view. One of the most important markers of the two killer factor was a bite mark that was left on this poor young woman's breast. And the original view was the killer has to be kneeling beside her to have done this. And then the other part was there have to be two killers, because the injury that happened to her sexual areas couldn't have been done at the same time as the injuries to her throat. So you have to have two. But when people went back, what was found was actually the bite mark was 180 degrees the other way up, and that the injuries to the poor girl's body could have been done by one person at more or less the same time. And that changed everything. And that meant that the psychological analysis became key. And one of the important parts was you're looking at somebody local. And that meant they could focus very narrowly. And as a consequence, they were able to arrest the offender very quickly.
You mention in the documentary that profiles should be primarily used as an exclusionary tool. Would you say that using it to specifically include a suspect is a dangerous practice?
One of the areas that has caused me extra effort is helping investigators to distinguish between those two factors. And the case that you're talking about, I think, is in the documentary, where at the beginning, the whole drive was to eliminate as well as to implicate. So you had to approach both even-handedly. It's easy for people to invest their emotion, their thinking in the wrong end of it, and you have to help them to come back. And that's been a big part of what I have done. Now, understand why. The reason why is because you're looking at men and women who are investigating, who have two factors. One is they're not specialists in this area, but the second is they really do want to solve this. If they latch early onto what they think is the offender, it's so difficult to help them to keep looking at other possibilities, but mostly they do.
When I interview individuals involved in forensic work from other countries, I always enjoy understanding the difference between how we work here and how they work, and which version is perhaps better. I think we very much like to think that our systems here in South Africa are rudimentary and not world-class, but I don't always think that's the case. In South Africa, of course, someone like Professor Britton would be part of the police service. He would be the rough equivalent of what Dr. Gerard Labuschagne did when he was in the SAPS. And we don't use external consultants very much here. So I asked Professor Britton to confirm that in the UK, psychologists such as him would work as consultants to law enforcement, and he was not directly employed within the ranks of the police. I also wondered whether he thought that this was best practice, considering it might be the very reason he was seen by the police as a safe bet to shift blame onto in the Rachel Nickel case. Or is it more important to maintain that level of distance and separation that a consultant space brings?
That is correct. I'm not a policeman. I'm a psychologist. Remember, in the early days, I worked as a clinician, and it's only later that I was asked to move into the forensic service, which I came to manage in the end. But even in the forensic service, it was fully in the National Health Service, not the police. We've moved forward since then. It was the case that the people giving advice tended, like me, to be from outside. I was asked by the British Home Office if I would review psychological profiling and its possible use in the police service here. And one of my recommendations was that we should have a register of all people who offered this service, and each case should be followed through and evaluated so that we could, if you like, know which tracks, which people were best on. And that's been moved way forward now. And we have policing degrees, and the people who go on to them are very often, not always, very often psychologists. And so we have forensic psychology literally within policing. And I'm fortunate enough to know a number of psychologists who head policing units in the UK. So the point you're making is really happening. And one of the factors, I don't know if you've ever heard of Catchem. I was privileged to be the joint designer of the Catchem database. So a long time ago, a man called Duncan Bailey, Detective Chief Superintendent, he was the head of CID in Derbyshire. He had been tasked by his police superiors, ACPO as they were then called, to look at this area and see if they couldn't bring something out of it. And I'd worked with Duncan on a number of offences, and Duncan came to me and said, can we do this together? And okay, we did. But the point I'm making is that out of this came the Catchem database. And if I look at all of the work I've done over the years in forensic areas, I think Catchem is probably the most important piece. It's not glamorous. There's no, oh, you caught this one or you caught that one, but the Catchem database and the principles have been used now throughout policing to bring so many crimes to a proper conclusion. And I think it's a really useful tool.
Catchem stands for Centralized Analytical Team Collating Homicide Expertise Management. It's a database containing details of the murders of women and girls under 21 years and boys under 17 years to assist investigators and profilers. Now, if you've listened to even a few serial offender episodes, you'll understand why this is so vital. And it really is a phenomenal achievement from Professor Britton. Back to the interview. I thought that it was really important that you pointed out that when you drew up your profile, you weren't doing so to match it to any given suspects, including Colin Stagg, but rather it was a picture of an unknown subject who'd killed Rachel Nickel, whomever that person may be. Do you think that there's a deep enough understanding of this distinct difference when people and maybe even the police think about criminal profiles as a tool?
I think that the point you're making is really important. It's perfectly clear and straightforward from my perspective, but it is key to helping people to understand it in the world of investigation. I can think of so many cases. Obviously the one that dealt with Napa and Mr. Stagg, and also the kidnappings, the abductions of Michael Sams and others, where the focus has to be on the mind and the functioning of the perpetrator. And everything that I can say is about that person. And then one of the issues I suspect is that because that turns out to be such a good fit for a number of people, say two, sometimes the investigator might look at the wrong one. And part of my role is to pull people back and to say, no, let's look a little more carefully. You haven't got this or you haven't got that. And even if you had, and this is something that sometimes takes some grasping, if you have a person who 100% is a match for a psychological profile, even down to the sexual fantasies that you describe, that doesn't make them guilty. That's a step along the way. That's a reason not to exclude, but it doesn't mean this is the person. You still need the evidence that the court would want, that the Crown Prosecution Service needs to move forward. And helping folks to hang on to that can sometimes be a task.
I know from working with other psychologists who do forensic work that using a strong set of both professional and personal ethics as a guide for their work is vitally important. Do you feel like the Rachel Nickell case was one of the most testing of your ethics in your career, despite you having done everything you could at the time to get the best result possible?
There were problems from a number of perspectives. The question that you've just put up is something that I asked right at the beginning. It's, what about the ethics? What about the morality? Where are we going? And the opinion, that the very strong opinion of the investigators was this has been looked at the highest levels in the Metropolitan Police and the Crown Prosecution Service. It sits right at the top of the Attorney General's watch list. Please be reassured, all of these things are looked at. And even then, my view was, that's good. Second thing is, we can only go forward involving me if we build in these very specific safeguards. So the question you're asking, absolutely important. I'm not sure if you're free to step away just from the Rachel Nickell killing and look at the other killings that Napa we know is involved with. If I go back to the Green chain rapes, which again was the same offender, I have one regret in that case. I went through the psychological analysis, I went across it all, and I presented my findings to the investigating team. It's a different team, and they simply chose to ignore it. Now, I knew as a psychologist that what I told them was accurate, and if only they did as I had suggested, they would take the person into custody. And if I had one thing I could do again, it would be I would stand and bang on the door until they did it. It goes back to your earlier point. I'm not a policeman. I'm an external, I'm a psychologist. I can only say, you've asked me to do this. This is what I'm offering. Please take it seriously.
I think there are a few important points this documentary raises. And the first is how dangerous it can be to pathologize someone's sexual fantasies if they're different from your own or from what's considered to be the norm. Really, I think this case showed that this can not only cause great shame for the individual, which is unnecessary, but can, as in Colin Stagg's case, have a life-changing impact.
Well, again, I think each of the points that you make are significant. I think the important thing to remember here is that the sexual psychological fantasies that we were talking about, although they are not unique, they are relatively uncommon. And so in terms of investigating, if you have someone who is producing this range of material, then it's worth looking further at them. Remember, simply having those fantasies does not make them guilty, but it doesn't eliminate them. And if you have someone who has no interest whatsoever in those sorts of materials, and it's important to remember that the person being investigated, Mr. Stagg in this case, was the person who introduced those strands. That was a key requirement. The police were not allowed to introduce anything like that. They could only respond to it once it had been introduced. The mere fact it's introduced is not sufficient to convict anybody. What it is, it's something that says, look a little closer.
Another important point that I think was raised is critical thinking and accurate reporting in the media and among other content creators. Do you think, given that perhaps the media were not privy to all the information they needed, that they could have done anything different in how they covered Rachel Nickell's case?
Yes, I'm sure that they could. There were so many factors that I think drew attention. Not the least was on the day at the time that this poor woman was killed on Wimbledon Common, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police's wife happened to be on the Common. And in a sense, that is something that excited the media. So that was one thing. She was a very photogenic young lady. I don't know if you're familiar with a children's program called The Wombles.
Yes.
Well, the Wombles of Wimbledon Common, they were associated with Wimbledon Common. So it was something else. Now, if you look at the murders of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett, also by Napa, not very far apart in terms of time, also looked at by me, also drawn to the police's attention for the same reason. Those investigating officers could not get media attention to the case. You had a mother absolutely butchered in her own house, absolutely dreadful. The police photographer who had to go to the scene of the crime never came back to work after having looked at her. You had her little tiny child terribly digitally raped and murdered and dressed up to look as though she's asleep. A most awful killing. And yet the police could not get media attention. So the point that you're making is so accurate. And why was that? Well, as near as we can tell, one of the issues was that it had been suggested that the mother had some untoward habits, that she may have been going down early stages of prostitution, but she wasn't. But that was enough. We have on the one hand this blonde-haired, blue-eyed, photogenic young lady photographed. We've got her. We can't spare the time to look at these other things. So your point, I think, is really important.
And this happens so often, even in missing person cases. The minute there's the suggestion that the person may have had a mental health issue or a substance use disorder, the public and press interest decreases dramatically. Professor Britton weighs in with an anecdote from his career that highlights this point.
I was asked to look at the murder of a young woman in Leicestershire, and she had been left in a very particular way at the roadside. She was naked. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been left in a hedgerow. Anyway, I dealt with this. I was able to give the police advice about her. The advice was she had worked as a prostitute. And then I was able to say, but look, I have seen this before. I was able to explain that in my personal work, I had dealt with another 3 women who had exactly the same presentation in different parts of the country, some in the Midlands, some not quite. And that led to what's called Operation Enigma here. And out of that, I think 200 unresolved murders, mostly dealing with working girls, ladies working as prostitutes, were found. And the view was that at least 2 or more serial offenders had been working on them, but they didn't really come to attention because of their working lives. And that is so sad. We were able to catch the man who had done the 4 that I mentioned, but I don't know about the others.
I wanted to really commend you for being brave enough to essentially stand up to the police service in this case and put forward your version of the story, because I think there's so much to be learned from what happened here, and we wouldn't have known that if you hadn't come forward. If there's one lesson to be learned by law enforcement and perhaps other criminal profilers from this case, what would you think that should be?
Well, there are several really, but I suppose if there was just a one, I would be wanting to help management of crime, management of investigators to be much, much more intelligently and persistently driven. This case falls down not because of the over-enthusiasm of investigators, really. The issue is that they weren't properly managed. I've worked on all sorts of cases over the years, and one of the things that really makes a difference is where you have an officer in overall charge of all the investigations who make sure that each of the teams are doing their job properly, and I'm afraid that this seems to have got away from that.
And that is my interview with Professor Paul Britton. Louise Shorter. Coming up, I had the distinct pleasure of interviewing Louise Shorter, a UK investigative journalist who's helped to reveal some of the greatest miscarriages of justice in British criminal history. I chatted with Louise about her work, wrongful convictions in general, and her work on the CBS Justice series Wrongly Accused. Here's my interview with Louise. I think that the entire concept of someone being wrongfully accused and convicted of murder is a very uncomfortable topic for most members of the public. Possibly because we'd like to believe, no matter what country we're in, that our justice system is infallible, because it's supposed to be to protect us. I asked Louise what her experience has been with the public reaction to some of the cases she's helped to reveal as wrongful convictions.
I think the most common reaction from the public is that they can't believe that this actually happened to somebody, to the individual, that they think that it's impossible for somebody, for so many things to go so wrong in cases. And so I think people sort of feel comfortable mostly with the sort of the idea that everything works pretty well. And I have to say, I think by and large, things do work pretty well, but in a system such as the criminal justice system, which has human beings at the heart of it, we are bound to have things that go wrong. And when we've got funding cuts and when we've got resources which are really overstretched, then it's really highly likely, I think, and increasingly likely that something will go wrong with an investigation. So I think that the public's reaction tends to be they can't believe it. And then when they realise how things have happened, they become very anxious that we should make sure the system it puts things right. A very wise chief constable of police said to me here in England one time that we police by consent in this country. And so most people do as they are told and as the law expects. And that's how we do things. We're not a police state. But the trouble is that if there is a general feeling that things aren't going quite as they should, not only that you might have innocent people that are being convicted, but also that the system isn't putting them right, isn't correcting that, isn't quashing the conviction. If that doesn't happen, then that fundamentally it shakes people's confidence in the criminal justice system. And then what is at stake there is people just doing as they should, through policing by consent because they don't trust the system. So these cases, these stories are really important to tell, I think, to make sure that we understand the responsibility that's placed on the criminal justice system to be properly resourced, to do thorough investigations, to make sure guilty people go to prison and that innocent people don't.
I asked Louise what got her into this field of work. Was there a pivotal moment or a case that convinced her that this was something she needed to do?
Well, when I was growing up as a teenager, there was a television programme on the BBC throughout England and Wales, throughout Great Britain, that was called Rough Justice. And it would carry out investigations on cases where somebody was in prison claiming they were innocent. And I used to watch that when I was a teenager. And I just thought it was incredible that you could have journalists come along and find all this stuff out, which the legal system and the police investigation and the trial hadn't managed to get quite right. So I thought that it was incredible that journalists could do that. And I just was really affected by the individual stories. And there were some really big cases happening when I was a teenager. So we had the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4 sort of political terrorism and sort of type cases where people have been in prison for a long time, and a lot of people believed that they were totally innocent. And you would often see articles in newspapers, television programs, radio programs, people saying they're not. That you would even have the people who were really guilty in those cases coming forward and saying that they'd done it, but still those innocent people would stay in prison. And then there were also individual stories. There were people like cases like Stephen Kisco, which we feature in Wrongly Accused, who was a lone man living at home with his mum, convicted of the rape and murder of a schoolgirl. And he was a really tall, gentle giant of a guy. And he had this tiny, tiny Ukrainian mother who just couldn't believe, wouldn't accept that her lovely, gentle son would do something so horrific. And she just kept on fighting and fighting and trying to raise awareness. And so there were cases like that just kept being featured in the news, and through this program, Rough Justice, that I thought was just incredible. And so I was really inspired by that program. And then something like 10 years later, I went and worked for the BBC in a totally different department, in the accounts department, but just trying to get into program making, and then managed to sort of work my way across and get a foot in the door and started working for the TV program Rough Justice. And so I was, that was sort of my way in, really. So it was through, and I found that actually when I was then a producer on that BBC programme for, I was at the BBC for 16 years in all, but I very often will find that I would phone an expert or phone a barrister or somebody I was trying to get to do some work, probably without getting paid, for the benefit of the case. And they would very often know Rough Justice. And that was a sort of a way to open doors and get people to do stuff. So it did a huge amount of good.
In 2010, when the organisation that Louise Shorter used to work for, called Inside Justice, was established, I wondered what environment was that she was coming into with this organisation. Was anyone else doing this work? And how was the organisation and what it stood for received?
Well, when I left the BBC and was then approached by somebody who was an editor of a newspaper for prisoners, called Inside Time, and the editor approached me and asked if I would write an article about the fact the BBC had axed this programme Rough Justice, and all the other media programmes that have been around at that time over here they'd all been axed one by one. They'd gone. And so there was nobody in the media that was really doing that kind of work. And this newspaper editor said to me, well, where do people go now? Where do prisoners go if they are protesting their innocence? Is there a media outlet where they can get this kind of support and help and exposure? And there wasn't. And so he knew the charity world, and he said to me, I think we should set up a charity and try and provide that service to people. I thought he was completely nuts, to be honest. I thought, I couldn't believe that a trust or a foundation would give money to helping people, people in prison that claim they're innocent. I just couldn't see that you could get funding, but we did get it. It took us nearly 3 years, but we did manage to get the funding. And I think the sort of general reaction from people was one of gratitude and relief that there was going to be a charity again that would provide that kind of free legal expertise and free scientific expertise. We had quite a big shift over here at that stage. So we used to have something called the Forensic Science Service, which was the national forensic provision, full of, just chock-a-block full of experts who would do forensic work for defence teams as well as the prosecution. And it was internationally renowned. It was world leading in terms of its expertise and its research. And it was just a fantastic body. But it was axed. It was the funding was cut by government, and it was axed. It was closed, within a very short period of time. And so that meant that a lot of people working in the defence world just couldn't get access to forensic scientists because they were working for labs that only did police work. There's not a lot of money in defence work. So it's just very hard to find forensic help if you're sort of, on the defendant's side of a trial. And so I think the establishment of the charity was really greeted with a lot of relief by people that there was access to experts. But also I think there was certainly it's got harder and harder, in my view, to be able to do work now on wrongful convictions cases than it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. So then now, when I started doing this work, which is 25 years ago, I started doing miscarriage of justice work. And at that stage, you could get access to police exhibits. You could send them off to a forensic lab and get some new tests done. You could pay for that work yourself for the prisoner, for the person in prison. Now, most police forces, they're sort of like their default position is not to release anything. So it's got harder and harder here to actually get access to material and to be able to do testing. So we're in a sort of quite so relief, I would say, was the reaction from people that were working with prisoners and working on for defendants. But there's been a sort of a general closing down and restriction of what you can do in terms, as far as the authorities go.
I wondered how Louisa decided which cases to take on and which people they were unable to assist.
Well, I always think that what you need to do is to get a really clear idea of all of the evidence that was there at the trial. Don't just listen to what the person in prison is telling you, but make sure you get a really clear, objective view of everything. And the single most important thing you need to do, in my view, is to identify what is the very best piece of evidence that the prosecution had. What is their strongest? What is the strongest thing the prosecution had against the person in prison? Because you need to work out basically whether or not the person who says they're innocent is whether there might be any truth in it, or whether they're wasting your time. Because everybody in prison says they're innocent. Everybody is going to use that line. So the trick is to sort of try and work out who might actually be telling the truth. So if you can identify the strongest piece of evidence, that means that you can then work out whether or not that piece of evidence is good. Because if that piece of evidence really is strong and really is solid, then you probably don't want to spend your time and energy dealing with that case. There's probably a more deserving case. So that's the way I go about it. Let's sort of see how this person got convicted. What's the best thing the prosecution had? Then test whether or not that evidence is solid. Is there merit in that? If they're relying on a DNA test for something, did they use the right DNA test? Is there a chance that it could have been contaminated? Is the DNA from something which actually looks suspicious but doesn't actually tell you whether the person committed the crime or not? Or was it on an item that was in the scene just as a sort of a secondary thing, coincidentally, rather than it being absolutely crucial to the murder itself or whatever it might be. So test the evidence and then look to see. The next thing that I always do, and that the Charity Inside Justice also still does, is to identify what could be done that wasn't done. We've had a lot of funding cuts particularly in terms of forensic science. Police teams are really overstretched here, and so investigations may not have happened that should have done. So we always try and identify, what if you could run the case again, what piece of work could be done that wasn't done, and and then maybe that piece of work wasn't done just because of funding, not because of it being a good investigative reason. So then try and get that piece of work done.
Although today we put a lot of stock in physical evidence and the forensic sciences, we're also seeing many of these investigative techniques being proven to be essentially junk science. I wondered what Louise's experience had been with how significantly poor scientific investigation had contributed to wrongful convictions.
I think that the way that the courts and the police deal with forensic science is a difficulty. Forensic science can be the best thing, the best friend for a police investigation, but it can also go horribly wrong. And I think the real difficulty is that there is a real disconnect, in my view, between the way that the law deals with forensic science and the way that forensic science deals with forensic science. So forensic scientists, they are open-minded. They think that if you understand that something that we used to believe was true is actually not true, we've got better knowledge now, and actually that's not what the science tells you. Very often, a very good scientist anyway will believe that that's still valuable knowledge, even if it knocks out what they previously thought they knew. They still believe that is progress, that new understanding, that new learning is progress. Whereas I think the law often has problems with that, because the law wants things to be, the law sort of believes in this principle of finality. So you have a trial, and that should be the last thing. And we don't really want to have appeals in most cases. By and large, the trial should be the last thing that happens. And so there is a disconnect, I think, between the way that the science and law deals with it. So I work on cases here where we can show clearly, absolutely, that the way that the science was explained to a jury was wrong. They were given a false impression of what it meant. The scientists misled them at the time, maybe unwittingly, maybe because their knowledge wasn't there at the time. But nevertheless, the jury convicted on a false basis. But the Court of Appeal very often doesn't really want to deal with that, because it worries about, well, if we go back and we say that the jury was told that bit wrong in that case, then are we going to have to do that in lots of cases? And are we going to get loads of appeals? And are we going to be overwhelmed? So look, the legal process here doesn't like dealing with science very often. I mean, I'm not, I should also say that we absolutely do have cases here where there is a belief that science can tell you a certain thing. And actually, there just wasn't enough knowledge about it. The first case that we show in Wrongly Accused is features this particle science, all these tiny grains of stuff that were found on a van seat that were also on the victim's skirt. And so the finding of these particle types in 2 locations, the scientist said, meant that she'd been in that van. And that was just nonsense. There was no scientific basis to that. And eventually, the court did put it right, and they got the conviction quashed, but not before the guys had spent 6 years in prison. So it's a difficult thing, I think, because a scientist, an expert, a forensic scientist, or an expert in anything, whether they're expert in CCTV or cell site evidence or whatever it might be, they can stand up in court and they can give an opinion based on the fact that they are an expert. So they are in a special category where they're allowed to say what they think of something. They can give their opinion. Most other categories of witnesses can't do that. So somebody who sees something, they can't say what they thought it meant. They can just say what they saw. An expert is in a special category. And so that means that we have to be very, very careful that those experts are talking about, something that is on a really good, solid foundation. And I think too often they don't, and that it's not clear. They're not on a solid scientific basis, and that's really dangerous.
I asked Louise what her experience has been of the jury system. Does she think that the system contributes or reduces possible wrongful convictions, or does it play no role at all?
We have a jury system here in England and Wales where we have 12 members of the jury, and the idea being that we will balance out any biases between, by having such a sort of a big pool. We can convict on a majority of 10-2. And I think that, I worry about that sometimes. I have certainly seen, I have not done, sorry, let me go back. I have certainly got a feeling, a sense over 25 years of doing these kind of cases, that there are occasions when juries reach verdicts on a majority on a Friday afternoon before, I've had cases where there was a big sporting fixture that was about to start and the jury suddenly reached a majority verdict just before that started. Or, so I worry about juries, wanting to get out of the room and just wanting it to be over, and so somebody buckles, and they come in then with a majority verdict. I worked on a case some years ago where a guy's in prison currently for serving a minimum of 30 years for murders, and I did an investigation about his case and put out a program where we spoke to the foreman of the jury, who said, If I had heard the evidence that you found in your investigation now, I would never have convicted. So that would have taken it to a 9-3. And then another juror came forward after that and said, I too wouldn't have convicted if I know what I know now. So that would have taken it to 8-4. But the guy's still in prison. He's still inside. So I think by and large, I think juries are a good system. I think it's a good system, but I worry about that just pushing somebody when it gets to a majority to buckle, and then you've got your majority and that's it, the life sentence is in. But one other thing I'd just like to say about jurors is that I listened to a talk by a law professor one time, and he was saying that he'd asked for a kind of a show of hands in the audience to what does sure mean when you have to reach a verdict of being sure. So we used to have something here called you'd have to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's what it's always been traditionally been called. We've now changed it over here to that you have to be sure of guilt. So it's the same thing, beyond, what does it mean? What does sure mean? What does beyond a reasonable doubt mean? So this law professor asked the audience for what kind of percentage do you think it means to be sure. Now, if I was standing trial for life and I wanted people to be sure, I would want that to be certainly over 95%, more like 98%, up in that kind of a. He found that his audience thought that their average was around about 85%. Now, I find it horrifying and really shocking that juries might be convicting on the basis of those kind of odds.
It's become very clear over the years across the world that no justice system is exempt from a certain level of favour towards those with resources and historic, racial or other privilege. I wondered what Louise's experience in the UK had been with this. Does money and other forms of privilege automatically buy you a better experience with the justice system?
I think it's certainly true to say, without a shadow of a doubt, that people who are less able to, whether it's through resources or their own intellect or whatever it might be, there are people who are disadvantaged in life are hugely disadvantaged by the criminal justice system. They're vulnerable, aren't they? They are to the whether it's that they can't properly express themselves during the interview, the police interview, whether they are fighting prejudices in terms of there being an assumption that if you look a certain way or you behave in a certain way or you come from a certain background that you are likely to be guilty of this crime, to not being able to gather the support and the resource that you need to get people on your side to be able to help you. Huge injustices that have happened through our history, and I'm sad to say are still alive and present today. Mm.
When anyone is killed, we automatically look at those closest to them, and often that includes the spouse or intimate partner of the victim. In the first episode of Wrongly Accused, Louise and the other experts acknowledge that this is the natural and logical progression of an investigation. I wondered how often Louise saw that blinkered focus on the partner becoming problematic and contributing to wrongful convictions.
I think it's common, and I think it's understandable to an extent, because if women are murdered, then most of those women are murdered by somebody who is known to them. That's the sad truth of who's going to likely to be attacking and murdering a woman. Is it somebody who's in her life currently or was in her life before? So it's kind of understandable, I suppose, that an investigation focuses in that way. But yeah, I think in that first case that we feature in Wrongly Accused, there was a belief by the police that if it wasn't the boyfriend who was with her on the night she went missing, then it had to be a random stranger, and they just didn't believe that was likely. But that's who it turned out to be. In the case that we feature, where Timothy Evans, where he was hanged, he was the husband of the woman who was found dead. It just turned out there was a serial killer living in the same house in a different flat. With the Joanna Yates case that we feature in Wrongly Accused, there was a young woman who was murdered, and it turned out it was a man who was living in the neighbouring flat who was the real killer. But the police zoned in on the landlord who lived in the same building because they thought that he was peculiar. That case came down to the way he presented. I mean, in that case, he was a highly intelligent man, a really compassionate man, a man who had been involved in all kinds of sort of safe neighbourhood schemes involving the police and communities. He was a pillar of the local community, but the police thought he was odd, and so they really honed in on him. And I think in his case, it was a sort of the strange sort of flip of truth in that one was that normally it's somebody who's quite vulnerable and can't really express themselves. In his case, he was very intelligent, and he was able to speak back to the police, and and to challenge them about assumptions they were making. And I think that riled them. I think it got under their skin, and they thought that was odd behaviour for somebody to do that. But yeah, it's very often it's a blinkered investigation that leads police down the wrong path.
I find it interesting to compare other legal systems to ours in South Africa, and I've noticed that many justice systems around the world focus on convictions and have very few avenues for exoneration processes, beyond limited appeals. I asked Louise whether she feels that the UK allows more for the possibility of wrongful convictions, or does their own system also need to be more robust?
We have here in England and Wales, we have something called the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the CCRC, which is a publicly funded body, which is independent of government, although government has a sort of government sponsoring department that makes sure that it's spending taxpayers' money appropriately, but its operations are dealt with independently. And that commission was set up in the late 1990s when we had a rush of wrongful conviction cases that were suddenly people were being released here. But there was a collapse in confidence in the criminal justice system here because it was clear to everybody, and there was a lot of reporting that innocent people were in prison and the appeal system wasn't dealing with it appropriately. And so we had hordes of people out on the street. There was a collapse in confidence, which really undermined the police's ability to do their job. Because nobody believed that it was working properly, effectively. So the CCRC was set up. And that's a very good thing. You know, we have this formal body which has statutory legal powers to be able to go and get evidence and to be able to do new tests. And that's good. We are advantaged here by having that. The difficulty is that that the funding has been really cut from it. It's become, the organisation is sort of often criticised for not being really investigative enough. It sort of lacks investigative curiosity. So there's been quite a lot of work done that's suggested that actually it doesn't get out there and find stuff. It sort of wants to have evidence presented to it on a plate that's going to lead to an appeal. And there is a criticism that's quite often made currently, which is that unless it feels that if it does certain investigations, it will lead to an appeal, it won't bother doing the investigations. But very often in these cases, you don't know what you're going to find until you do it. And so to have a guarantee of an outcome that's going to lead to an appeal means that by and large, most stuff won't get done. So we do have a solution now post appeal for how people can get back again, get their cases, get their convictions quashed. But it is increasingly attracting criticism, and that criticism is therefore undermining confidence in the criminal justice system again. So we have something, but it's starting to go wrong, I think.
Donald McIntyre. Donald McIntyre is a renowned UK investigative journalist and criminologist. McIntyre appears in the CBS original Killer Evidence. In this interview, I chat with Donald about his work in investigative journalism, his undercover reporting, and his insights into investigations and the killer evidence he's seen come up in cases. Killer Evidence focuses quite heavily on physical forensic evidence in crimes. In your early career as an investigative reporter, many of these forensic tools didn't exist, or they were in their early stages. What's your experience been of how the process of criminal investigations has changed over the years as a result of these new forensic techniques being added to the arsenal?
Well, that's a very good question, because two things. It reveals to the audience that I'm as old as a dinosaur. And secondly, it does hit upon not only the work I did in the past, but also some of the cold cases I do now. So well done, Nicole. No, it's a great question. And thank you for that. I think what's interesting is I just, on some of the back in the day, in around the early 1990s, I was doing undercover investigations. So as part of my own investigative stuff, and we were kind of, we worked by ourselves, but I would say our covert and undercover standards and practices were higher than the police. We probably had more resources than the police. We went undercover in the world of fraudsters and drug dealers and football hooligans and the fashion industry, to name, and we hit blue collar and white collar. And so then the evidence we were creating were not only traditional journalistic paper evidence, we were investigating and gathering first-hand testimony, and we were following it. And the usual rules around that would be your traditional American kind of application of rules. You don't really want to incite people to say anything that they otherwise wouldn't do. You're not paying or bribing people to say things that they wouldn't do. And the evidence has to be pretty pristine. The other thing about that is that when we go to court, and we often have got convictions on the basis of the evidence as kind of journalistic, we're not journalistic prosecutors, but inevitably in this arena, we often come and work for the BBC and ITV and CBS Justice. But in the early days, we would assume a role because the defense teams would prosecute us in the witness box, but we would have no defense where we couldn't redact evidence, we couldn't have PII, public interest immunity stuff, where we could take away material, every expense, every email. It was the full-on Donald Trump disclosure from Congress. Nothing was hidden. So in that respect, my practice as an early investigator / pseudo journalistic prosecutor, and that's a term I've just invented now. But I reckon, talking to you, I understand that we were kind of in that prosecutorial role, but our evidence gathering was face-to-face testimony, and that's hugely persuasive. But the bar we placed was on video evidence. What you see is what you get, and that's a very strong and powerful weapon. At the time, the very first conviction for reliant upon DNA, forensic DNA, was around 86 or 87, if I'm not mistaken. And so the first real murder that I've been looking at, I'm just looking at a cold case murder of Sophie Toscan de Plantier in 1996. I also did a lot of work on the murder of Stephen Lawrence in the same year, maybe it was 1993, maybe, and basically the involvement of DNA in that. In relation to the Sophie Toscan de Plantier murder, where a suspect was convicted in France, and this took place in Cork, it was the murder of a French film producer, hugely powerfully connected to the French political establishment and Mitterrand, and the police, the Irish police at that stage, came in and they effectively focused on one man who volunteered his DNA in 1996, knowing the context of what that meant, but his DNA was never found in a brutal and graphic crime scene, and which basically, to my mind, said, listen, this guy must be innocent. But the standards of the quality of that, was so poor. I mean, really, it was kind of, prehistoric in terms of the evolution of crime. The DNA, in terms of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, which became a landmark crime for racial injustice in terms of the institutional racism in the UK, and still percolates about police corruption and all of this in the UK. It took a friend of mine, Clive Driscoll, that took until 2011 or 12 to finally get convictions, and £3 million worth of taxpayers' money to re-scrutinize and to take the original material from the crime scene and then retest it. And that material had been tested many, many times. But in this respect, the most powerful tools, £3 million worth, were able to go at a very subatomic level and get microspecks of DNA and fibers to get a conviction in that case. I think in relation to the case, which I have done a program on with Jim Sheridan, who's a kind of a very esteemed film producer and director. We did a film on the murder in the cottage on Sophie Toscan de Plantier, and we're hoping that there is a new DNA investigations. But it does show that the evolution, not the cost. So the quality has risen, but the cost of those investigations are huge. And there's no doubt, apropos killer evidence, and our focus on DNA and the forensic CSI specialists, is that people often forget that one of the biggest turning points in any investigation is the quantum. How much will this cost? And you will say, well, every life is worth everything. Well, you can't spend £3 million on a hope and a prayer. And because the Lawrence inquiry and Clive Driscoll, Chief Superintendent Clive Driscoll, because he bullied his way And often it's the police officers. So the first thing is the cost. So how do you get over that? Well, that cost is only really very much available for unique and high profile and what they call signal crimes, signal cases. And signal crimes are those crimes that we associate that kind of have a transformative impact on the society beyond the murder of one young 18-year-old. You know, sad as that is. The murder of Stephen Lawrence transformed the rules and regulations at the workplace around all the UK. So it was a transformative case, and £3 million. It was unsolved for nearly 15 years, and then £3 million were spent on it. And so the cost is important, but the personality of the police officers who are engaging with some of the DNA companies and specialists are also crucial, because Clive Driscoll, he could easily have said, well, we can't solve this. It's been DNA to death tested. And he tells me this wonderful story that he had these top doctorates in some of these top, in physiology and biology and forensic testing, who were telling, these are guys who were Cambridge and Oxford degrees, saying, listen, I'm telling you, Clive, this is my expertise. We have done everything we need to do. There's no more to be done. And he would say, well, I appreciate your doctorate from Harvard and from Cambridge, but I got a D in woodwork in my GCSE, and I'm a stupid cop. And I'm telling you, I'm the CIO, I'm the Senior Investigation Officer, SIO, and we're doing it. That's it. And he also persuaded, through force of character, Cressida Dick, the then commander at the Met, to spend the money. So it's not just that the techniques have involved, it's also that the cost of it is involved, but also it shows the ecosystem and the persuasive ecosystem to work with your DNA specialists and your forensic specialists, your team, and to have the force of character to know when to apply that pressure. We need the money now, this will solve it. But of course, if you take the £3 million and you don't get a result, as likely as, then of course you've lost your political and social capital. And the next time you really need that money, you mightn't have it. So it's really interesting that people often forget the role of budget and personality and personnel in the battle against crime, because if someone doesn't fight hard enough to pursue one line of inquiry or fight hard enough for a budgetary line, then those lines are not pursued, and they may very well be the lines that might solve the case.
I think that leads quite well into my next question, which is, have you ever felt as though investigators rely too heavily on techniques like DNA? And do you think that this could perhaps make for a less effective investigation overall?
Oh, that's a really good question, because I think you're absolutely right. I think there, very interestingly, there often is an over-reliance on the CSI to pull it in, because officers come to the scene and they decide, and with reasonable intuition and experience and gut feeling. And I'm a supporter of gut feeling, because a gut feeling and intuition is built upon years of experience. So it's about using the back processes of your mind, synapses crackling, and they're saying, right, how do we and all their information experience distills into a theory or a couple of theories. And they say, well, I can say here, and they can do, like a experienced burglar walking down a suburban street, they know the landscape so well, they can know by the car outside the driveway where the key is placed. Is it placed under a milk bottle? Is it placed under the flower pot? Is there a back window going to be open? There's a lot of presumed and experiential knowledge here. Same with the investigators. And they can build a picture of what is a likely perpetrator and means of murder here. But that also, sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes I think this is how it's going to happen. Surely with this entire landscape here, we are going to be able to pick out and with the DNA, absolutely get the suspect. And in this case, but sometimes that isn't the case. I'm reminded, really interestingly, I've just finished a book called A Million Ways to Stay in the Run, about a very infamous murder over here, which was it was the murder of a road rage suspect, Stephen Cameron, by Kenneth Noy, who had stabbed a policeman, but had, and that was a case of self-defense, and a very unusual case. In any case, he was the public enemy number one, and he got involved in a road rage case. Now, this is a classic case in point about how you interpret evidence initially. So, initially, the chief inspector, Nick Bidders, is on a golf course. He's in charge of all the murders in that area, and he gets a call on the golf course, blah, blah, blah. Murder, road rage incident, knife involved. There's about 30 or 40 witnesses. There's CCTV everywhere. He thinks it's a self-solver, right? Somebody's going to see, we're going to get a number, a car, CCTV, going to track it down. Likewise, the perpetrator, Kenny Noy, thought, listen, Jesus, this is going to self-solver. There'll be witnesses, my car, blah, 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 everything, right? So what he did was, the perpetrator, Michi went home. He didn't think he died at first, but once he realized the guy died, he immediately arranged his departure from the country. He got rid of the car, replaced his car with another car in a very clunky kind of way, got the car destroyed and fled and disappeared, right? So, but what actually happened was the CCTV cameras didn't work. The witnesses were by and large completely unreliable. They never got the proper, his car might have been one of 20,000 Land Rovers or Range Rovers. So in fact, and there was no DNA in the scene, and this was 1996. So there was actually everything that the perpetrator had assumed the police would have, and everything that the police assumed they would have about the perpetrator and witnesses, it never happened. So if the perpetrator had actually done nothing, simply gone home and done nothing, he'd have got away with it. And that's one of those things about presumed kind of reliance upon the evidence in the landscape. And of course, you're absolutely right. There is a fear that we're reliant entirely upon DNA to solve the case. The reality is, in UK crime cases, and murders are only a fraction, DNA is only used in about 2% of cases. Why would you use it? You know, because it's too expensive. So they use it for murder cases and violence and maybe big theft cases. But in the totality of crimes from the magistrates' court to the more serious which appear in the Crown Court over here, very few cases actually use that. You know, all the evidence is gathered, so if they need it, yes, but they wouldn't send per se every item off for DNA testing at all. You know, but obviously with murders and all of that stuff, you'd imagine, yeah, yes, they would. They would. So, yeah, no, it's a very interesting point you raise.
In the first episode of Killer Evidence, you mentioned how you think AI might eventually be able to take over some functions in the analysis of certain types of evidence. Can you talk a bit more about some of the other roles you foresee AI being helpful with in criminal investigations in the future?
Well, I think we started off with kind of automatic number plate recognition, right? And then I'm reminded that basically that when officers are given CCTV, like currently, and they're and trained officers, they're working their way through, like, so let's go through somebody in a major city. They're going through, there might be 140 cameras, 200 cameras. Somebody's got to process all of those, right, in a time slot and work their way out and see it. And it's a very difficult and time-consuming. First, it takes, so for each, to my mind, because I have done this myself on my own evidence that I've gathered undercover, that in order for you to log the material and then to go through it and forensically examine it. So to examine 1 hour of material for, forensically and to an evidential standard, it probably takes about 6 hours. So now we understand that, with ChatGPT-4 and then if you're working with these companies, AI companies, you would work with your own programs, you would quite predictably be able to put in your parameters into a program with ChatGPT-4 or equivalent, and that all that work would be done practically instantaneously. And you would say this person here, and they would track. So that problem is solved in an instant. And so now I can imagine this. I can imagine. I would be surprised if it's not being done on the side right now. That people say, here is the list of suspects. Here's what we know about them. There's the social media accounts. Go ChatGPT and see who you think is most likely. I can see it. At the moment, I'm sure there are guys in Quantico, and there are guys that's in the FBI headquarters in the US. I'm quite sure that they're playing a parlor game with ChatGPT and developing that into tools as we speak. More interestingly, I think, in relation to the other era, I mean, they're now, in terms of committing a crime and how to, this other parlor game, how to commit the perfect murder. If you're the people who really know how to commit a perfect murder are those who we call our non-apprehended offenders, i.e. the people who got away with it. They're the people who know. And people who've been involved in that kind of arena, they nowadays, with the proliferation of cameras and digital technology and landscape, it's very, very difficult not to leave a trace. But just sometimes, and mostly, if people get away with murder, it's because they're very, very lucky. Something falls down, something happens. I did speak to one criminal recently, and he said he was involved in a difficult crime scene about 30 years ago, and he said this guy they had some beef. This guy was going to take him out, and so he said, "I'm going to take him out before he does." And so he spent one day casing him out and thought it'd be all good. And he knew, because he had beef with this particular guy, that the police would come knocking on his door as a likely suspect. But he had an alibi, so he had his car at home, he was there, and he snuck out the back, took another vehicle and went there. So in the first day he went there to the guy's house, the target wasn't present. The second day he went there, and as he was arriving up there, he saw all these police activity out there, and somebody else had got to him first and killed him. And to my friend's mind, that was the perfect murder. He went to kill him, but somebody else got there first, and it's like, okay, man, yeah, fine, So it's very difficult to commit the perfect murder, but nowadays they will be able to, in the future, within 10 years. If you go into a room and breathe, your DNA will be there, right? If you go, the identification, it's so microscopic, and what we leave, and even everybody smells and odor is so distinctive that I'm sure in 10 years, just a mere breath in a room will be able to locate somebody in that room. So that's getting very, 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 very exciting. So the prospect of committing a murder and getting away with it in highly developed countries with highly developed kind of, and not on where violence is on the scale that it is in South Africa, but in, say, in the UK and in America, outside of gangland violence, the likelihood of getting away with it is kind of increasingly slim. But so it's a fascinating area where ChatGPT and science will go.
Listening to you tell that story, do you think that the undercover reporting work you did has given you a different perspective of criminals and crime in general? Do you feel like you've maybe witnessed the underbelly that we all view from a removed place firsthand?
Well, when I went undercover in the drug gangs in Nottingham, and and the drug dealers there were earning, this was in 1997, they were earning like £350,000 a week. This is then cash profit. And one of them told Wayne Hardy, and I got to know him. I got a job it took me 9 months to get a job as a bouncer and curry his favor, and I became his gym buddy. And if you're an undercover copper, you'd be expecting results very quickly. But if you're an undercover copper, you would have two people around you supporting you. I was there in the city all by myself, so it was kind of reckless of my employers to put me in that position. But as it happened, I came out safe. But I got to know him as a person, as a friend. But my job was to basically, in television terms, convict him for a drug dealer, which I did, right? But subsequently, I came back and revisited him, and although he got time in jail for other crimes, but he was made notorious in front of kind of 9 million viewers. That was the kind of ratings we had back in the day. And we did a 2-part series called Wayne's World and The Untouchables. And I befriended him, and he came back. We did a film together. And the film where he presents himself, yes, in his arena, he was incredibly entrepreneurial. If he was middle class, he'd be a share dealer and make loads of money. And in fact, he has spent some time in South Africa, was deported from South Africa. But he was a lovely guy, and he was, but and would have had a nasty side to him, but I saw the human quality to him. And I think living cheek by jowl with these criminals over long-term, infiltrative, immersive, kind of, and you're buried in the world rather than jumping in for a day or being, meeting them in prison as you would as a criminologist or as a forensic psychologist or even prison governor. No, it was fascinating. So you get to see a more rounded kind of perspective on them. And I must admit, when we did a show together, he told me that about when he was in prison, his first his partner committed suicide and took his firstborn child at the same time in this terrible tragedy. His brother died, just accidentally, but his daughter became a 14-year-old daughter as a drug dealer, became a crack addict, and he worked with her. And so, it's not without tragedy, and it's not entirely without reason why some of these people end up in crime. But I've always tried to look and expand. So it wasn't just a job of, right, okay, I went undercover in this guy's world, we trained together, became best mates, and then after 9 months or 10 months, I said, oh, hi, by the way, you knew me as Tony. And he's looking at me, and there's a TV crew. I am, in fact, Donald McInerney, World Action reporter. And it's like, and you can just imagine his face went white. And to his credit, he didn't react violently. But then, very quickly, he went off with another colleague of his to try and kill me. I've subsequently befriended his other colleague. He now works in the criminal justice system and as a social entrepreneur, repairing the lives of young criminals. So if you're keeping your eyes open and see people beyond their crimes, I'm not apologizing for their crimes or excusing it, but I do think the way to try and, as our, CBS Justice audience does, and as our audience and our true crime audience does, it's not just a visceral, raw, interest in this world of true crime. I've noticed the true crime audience become much more sophisticated. Like me as an individual, they want to know more, they want to understand more. It no longer is just saying 2 legs bad, 4 legs good, or in the or in that sense, the Orwellian sense. It is much. They want to understand why, how, where, what are the antecedents, what are the precedents, and also, how can we help prevent that? In the first instance, the drive is to get justice for the victim and the victim's family, to hold them accountable. And then the next step has to be to understand and perhaps reclaim and then prevent further instances of that. And interesting, in murders here in the UK, where there is a real where for example the state could have done better if they released the prisoner and he committed murder, or if there was a police failure or institutional failure. There's a thing called an Article 2 inquest, where they can have a long-standing inquest which is dedicated not only to finding out how someone died, why they died, but also what lessons can be learned. And I think that in many ways the viewer, the true crime viewer, the CBS Justice and viewer, is interested in that kind of Article 2 kind of analysis. They want to know, how, why, and also what can be done. And I think they get, I think they do get a kind of boost when they know that that additional layer is given to a program or an investigation. The how, why, but also how we can prevent this in future.
I don't want to give too much away about the series before viewers watch it, but in that first episode, you mentioned that the offender, having pled guilty, served his psychopathic need to boast about his crimes. This desire for attention is often clear in serial offenders with psychopathic tendencies during trials. But why do you think that this offender would have preferred to admit his crimes rather than having the full experience, so to speak, of hearing months of evidence about his crimes, as well as all the attention that would have brought him?
I think it's about control and power, and that he had no control over whether he's going to be convicted. He likely would do, but then the victory would have been given to the jury and to the police and the prosecutors. Right? In this case, he had the power of surprise, and control. I decide. I'm the man who decides who's guilty, who's not. I'm the person. So that was his matrix. So he was a performer, and a performer always knows it's not how long you're on screen, it's the punch. It really is this. It's the smack, crackle and of a single moment, which makes you the star. So if it had been a long, drawn-out process, he got a conviction as everyone expected. Where was his moment? His big moment is the moment we're still talking about. To everybody's surprise, he pleaded guilty, and I think that was his effort at control. He was now the master of ceremonies, and so he basically, having set everybody else up for this kind of the jury, the judge, everybody for a long, drawn-out kind of courtroom. This wasn't a gift to the victims. This wasn't a gift to the budgets of the criminal justice system. This was absolutely a kind of ownership of control and power and a performance. I'm in charge, and like I was during the execution of these murders, I remain the ringmaster.
Jackie Moulton. I was incredibly privileged to be able to interview Jackie Moulton recently. As one of the first women to ever join London's notorious flying squad, and one of the youngest detective inspectors ever, at 25 years old, Jackie retired from the service with honour and now spends her days consulting to TV crime shows and working with offenders with substance use disorders in prisons across the UK. She is one of those pioneering women that I seriously look up to. And I think I grinned like a weirdo for the entire interview. So without further ado, here is my interview with Jackie Moulton. You've said that asking why after a crime is committed has led you to the real truth of many situations in your career. I thought that was quite interesting because as a police officer, you wouldn't necessarily need to know why to do your job. You just need to know who and how. Are you able to share some ways that you think that curiosity about the roots of a crime has helped you in your career?
So the police said to me they're not interested in the whys and the wherefores, if you just said that. And did they or didn't they? And it was about evidence. But everything is in context, I think. And I think the context is important. And when I kind of was more experienced, I could often put the context in what we would call a report to the CBS or report to the solicitors' departments, etc., etc. So it doesn't make any difference what they've done at all. But I think it's all about, not in every circumstances, you can't say to an armed robber, why did you do it? That's a bit pointless. But where there were crimes whereby, I remember this guy who was arrested for taking a bank manager hostage in Oxford Street, centre of London, in the West End. And he'd taken him hostage he was an engineer, and he made this hand grenade that looked really, really, well, it looked real. It didn't look an imitation. And the bank manager kind of feigned illness. And as he kind of feigned illness, he bent down and he pressed the emergency button and the man was arrested. So then he said, why was the reason? And he'd been given a overdraft by this particular bank, and the bank had just, for his business, and the bank for some reason had just withdrawn it, and it absolutely ruined him. And he was so frustrated that in his outrage, which is not a clever thing to do at all, that he took a bank manager hostage in protest type of thing. And I think sometimes you have to put that in context as to the reasons why, because if you didn't, then there's no story, and there's no story for the judge. And I did say to the judge, I didn't think this man had ever reoffended, and he hasn't, as far as I know, he's reoffended. So I think sometimes, I remember the judge saying that it was gratifying, he said, to hear a police officer talk about the narrative, the story. And so I just sometimes think where it's appropriate that you should ask the whys and the wherefores. And also the whys and the wherefores as a society helps us understand other people, stand in their shoes for a little bit, etc. So I'm in a prison now, and I listen to the whys and the wherefores, sorry about that, the whys and the wherefores all the time. And, many of them adverse childhood experiences. So it was my professional curiosity. The other thing that's really important is that if you engage in them in a way that is mutual, then they will be willing to talk to you and often reveal stuff.
So just to clarify, when Jackie says I'm in prison now, she means working in a prison, not incarcerated in one. Back to the interview. I found it interesting that you hadn't excelled at school the same way as your siblings, but once you joined the police service and found something you were passionate about, you really started to show your true potential. I've seen that with many other successful professionals too. Do you think that experience made you see people you encountered in law enforcement differently? Maybe as though if they'd only found their purpose, their potential may not have been misused in criminality.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a bit of a fighter for the underdog. And I think, we had in this country an exam called the 11 plus, which you're destined, your life is destined at age 11, which way you will go, you pass or you'll fail. I mean, I did further education later on and I rectified it. But the point about it all is at that time, there's a judgment value. And everybody has a story. All of us have a story. Every one of us has a narrative to our lives. And I think that's really important. So, yeah, it did. Because you can identify and you could have some form of understanding and a bit of empathy. Empathy is huge, I think. It's really, really huge. And I found it important to be, I don't mean I'm a soft touch, because I wasn't a soft touch. I was a tough cookie, but the empathy to me is I'm naturally empathic. So it was just to enable often to be empathic for them to open up and talk to you. And you would get, honestly, you would get confessions that way. You'd get confessions to the crime by being empathic.
And that's something we discuss in the podcast quite a bit, is understanding offender behavior, not to excuse it, but to understand so that we can try and help others.
Yeah, so if you listen to adverse childhood experiences that are not dealt with as youngsters, then what basically happens is they grow up with what you call an arrested development, and now they're in a male body and female, but both sexes, of course, and they're still reacting as that child, which is in the sense of their emotions, their behaviours are childlike in many, many ways, because nobody's dealt with those issues. So that's what we do in prison, is to deal with those issues, and those are the things that I really enjoy most of it. I mean, all of it, talking to them and getting them to kind of, own up about the childhood. And of course, they never see any of that themselves, never see any of it.
So much of your early life and career was spent trying to simultaneously be yourself while also trying to belong. And I found it so interesting how when you admitted your alcohol addiction and contacted the guy from AA, you said to him, I think I'm one of you. Do you think you found a sense of community within people in Alcoholics Anonymous that you maybe struggle to find elsewhere?
Well, what you do is you find a sense of community because it's about understanding another person, that everybody, as I said many times, nobody has an ambition to be an alcoholic because it's mental torture. Absolutely not. And I've been there 30 years. I've heard thousands of stories and things, but it is about identification with what the alcohol did for the individual, which feels, all of them say that they were kind of riddled by fear, insecurity, vulnerability. Everyone says that, including men, and they felt this hole in the soul. So what is common denominator was the feeling of the hole in the soul. And then when the alcohol went down the throat, it kind of, it joined the dots. And it was a really nice feeling that it was just one of comfort. And then, of course, what alcoholics, including myself, were trying to anchor myself externally. When you try and anchor yourself with a sense of belonging externally, then you do lose yourself, because you have to anchor yourself internally. And the recovery program teaches you, and through your own experience and through the work that you do on yourself, why was I shameful? Why did I feel like this? What's my part in it, etc. And of course, the learned behaviors of your thinking. So we think, and it becomes like a habit of your thought processes and stuff. So in recovery, you have to look at the thought processes, start to change those thought processes, and really start to work on yourself in order to validate yourself. So the anchoring, again, the sense of belonging, is not external. It has to be internal. And then I can, of course, have my friends externally and all of that type of thing. But what people thought of me, my validation, external validation, cannot come externally. I have to have my own sense of self. And for many, many addicts, they lose that. They have lost the sense of self. And along the way, for whatever reasons, you get peace, and you just, it's peace with yourself. And also the other thing is that you live your life in a way within your own moral compass and your own integrity and your own authentic self. So, we're not saints. Of course, we're not saints, and it would be ridiculous to suggest so. But for the majority of your kind of life, the way that you feel about yourself, is good. And if you snap at somebody, or I don't know, whatever it might be, or you have a thought about somebody and you think, well, where does that thought come from? And it's normally would come from something within yourself. So you can manage your own thoughts on a daily basis, have a reflective, process. And it just feels so good to live your life like that, apart from worrying, if you're worried about what other people thought of you all the time, which I did, by the way, I did, against myself, And then if the boss wanted to see me, tell me on a Friday, see you Monday, I think, weekend, well, what does he want to see me do? It'd all be negative and stuff like that. And I know that in my life today, most of the time, not all of the time, I live within my own integrity. And if I breach that, then I will apologize, to say, I will kind of look at it. And if I upset you, for example, then I'd say, I'm really sorry about that. I own it, and that's it. So it's kind of, I don't know. It's just a nice way to live your life. And you don't have, like if you're with somebody and they're quite negative about other people and moaning and groaning, it becomes so toxic. And you know what? I can't be in their company for long. I just can't. And you kind of go, I don't want to live my life like that. I want to live my life how my dog, what my dog thinks I am. And my dog loves me unconditionally. And that's how I want to be with my friends and stuff.
How much has admitting and working through your own substance use issues helped you to better understand the offenders you've worked with, if at all?
Oh, no, I only work with offenders with substance issues. So, yeah, the identification is there all the time. I'll just give you a little example. There's a guy I've been working with there's two. There's one that's just been released. He called me the other day, and I knew he was being released, although he didn't know when. And he was in for domestic violence. And he'd been convicted twice and had prison sentences for domestic violence on partners, etc., etc. But he believes he's a nice guy. He believes, that's not me. That's not really who I am. And I said, well, and I'm quite tough with him. You're sitting in prison because you've abused women. Let's kind of look at that. And looked at his control issues and stuff like that. And I really homed in on him, and he didn't like it. He didn't like it because he couldn't believe he was that person. And again, it's the rationale, isn't it? I'm not that kind of person. His whole behaviour in all of his life was control, even his work. So anyway, it's a very long story short. He came to me and said, you're absolutely right, Jackie, I've got it. I can see with clarity, my part in it, etc., etc., etc. And there's another one I mentor. He's a double life. He killed 2 people in a 10-day binge. My other one, he didn't kill anyone. He assaulted his partners. But this other one, he killed 2 people in a 10-day binge of addiction. So he served 32 years in prison, and then he'd been released about 2 or 3 times. He kept picking up a drink, relapse, and he'd get recall. So we had to look at these issues, etc., etc. And I've been with him now for, I don't know, got to be 5 or 6 years, and he's just been released into the community. But I know he won't pick up a drink. I know that he. Well, I don't know, but I don't think he will. I don't think he will, because we've looked at those issues as to why he would pick up a drink, and they're often in relationships. There is often, in his case, he was a rescuer, and then there's another thing in addiction. So, excuse me saying it, but addicts will have what they call a fuck it button. And, they might get into some form of, I don't know, a little row or something at home with their partner. And then, they get to a point and go, fuck it, go down the pub. And, it's game for everyone. And then, of course, it gets recalled. So you've got to manage and learn to manage that fuck it button.
It's vital to identify that, because when you do, then you can be aware when you start to get to that point and choose something else.
Exactly, because it's a habit. You see, the other thing is also, what's quite interesting about habits, when you ask people who are non-alcoholics or addicts, where they don't have much sympathy for the addicts and alcoholics, you say to them, right, on New Year's Eve, when you make your New Year resolution, how long does it last? And of course they go, oh, well, 3 weeks, 3 days, 3 months. And that's about it, because it's a habit. It's an absolute habit. And you have to change the neural pathways in your brain, and that takes work, etc. So those, you just kind of think, well, hold the mirror up to yourself, because, addiction is a habit of the solution to the problems that they're facing. Because they're not working it through, they're not working themselves through, and that's when they press the fuck it button. And at the point they say, actually, we've got to go beyond that, work that through, let's go beyond that. What else can you do, etc. But, New Year's resolution, they go, oh, well, yeah, within 3 months, it's raining outside, the football's on the TV, and they go, oh, fuck it, I'm not going to go to the gym. It's the same process.
Tell me about your transition after retiring to working in television as a script consultant. Those are 2 very different worlds. What was that like for you?
Well, I'd already had, obviously, a bit of experience with working with a scriptwriter, because I'd helped Linda LaPlante with Prime Suspect, some 6-7 years earlier. So then I worked on Prime Suspect 1, 2, and 3, and then other people within the media asked if I could give advice to them on programmes. So I then told the Metropolitan Police that that's what I was doing, and etc. So you have to inform them. So because of Prime Suspect, then I got a bit of a name for myself, and then people wanted the authenticity. So that's what happened. Now, after you leave the police, policing changes very, very quickly, procedures, processes, etc., etc. So I'm out of it now, and I'm not in it in the sense of understanding what's being changed. So I then transitioned, not intentionally, but it happened to come my way. Somebody asked me to get involved in a documentary, and then that has taken off massively in terms of documentary work, which I much prefer, to be perfectly honest, because and it was the first time that they'd had one ex-cop talking to other ex-cops about some very high-profile crimes that people had dealt with. So that was how it worked. And then that's kind of carrying on for me at the minute. So I'm very, very happy to do that, because I'm very interested in the truth and the facts, and also have the ability, because you do understand, because you've been an ex-cop, when you talk to other ex-cops, you have much more layers of depth and nuances. And they always said to me, it's much better talking to you because you get it, as opposed to a non-police person.
There's no doubt that you faced a tidal wave of discrimination during your time in the police service, and you've been described as almost a chameleon who needed to adjust to the environment to try and fit in. I wonder how much of you as a person was shaped by that forced fitting in, And do you think that you eventually managed to find your way back to who Jackie may have been without being a police officer? Or is it all ingrained in you?
No, probably not. I think what happens is that all of those things that affect well, let's take that question, peel it back a bit. Who knows what would have happened if I hadn't been a police officer? But everything that has happened to me because I was a police officer and because of other stuff has made me the person that I am. So I'm very grateful for the journey, however horrible it might have been on occasions throughout. So that's made me Jackie. The addiction has made me Jackie, all of that kind of stuff. So when you're, nobody's born an addict, are they? And nobody's born, you're not born an addict, or you're not born feeling less than. It's just all these things that happen to you. And now when you said I was a chameleon, there's a sense of wanting to belong and fitting in. That's absolutely right. But I think my difference there was that I still spoke out, even though I wanted to belong. So there was the dichotomy and there was the incongruence. So that was the uncomfortable feeling. So I spoke out, but I wanted to belong. And the two don't go together. And that's that's what happened. Or the discomfort, absolute discomfort. And if I was a chameleon and wanting to belong, then I've said nothing. But throughout my career, I've always spoken out about all sorts of things.
Now, this is not so much a question as a statement, and I'm sure it didn't feel like it at the time, but I was thinking that there's probably no more validating statement for a woman than "we don't know what to do with you." You've got to be doing something right when people say that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They didn't know what to do with it because the majority of the men in those days did not want an operational female in the mainstream, because we had been in the in the stream of policewomen hierarchy. Now we're opened up to the mainstream, and then they didn't know what to do with me. So the thing is, he did me a favor. So that was good.
You often used sex workers as informants and forged bonds with them. Do you feel like your gender assisted you in doing that? I can only think that these women would not have been nearly as comfortable with a male officer.
Absolutely, definitely that helped. And do you know what? I always remember some of those sex workers, as we call them now, but we called them prostitutes at the time, that if you had a missing girl, a young girl, 14, from the care system, let's say, they're often from, do you understand about the care system? They've been put in care. Yeah, so, and they've gone missing from home. Missing from the care centre. I'd always go and speak to the girls. And I remember one lady saying to me, come back in half an hour, Jackie, and I'll have her. But I'll have her here. And the reason for it was they're saying, I don't want this kid to end up like me. And there was lots and lots of poverty way back in the 70s. There was women with single mums, they had a pimp that was working them, etc., etc. And the whole setup was where a woman did not have her own voice. And again, what really annoyed me at the time, it was an act committed by two people, a man and a woman. The only legislation that was in play was under the Street Offences Act, which was against the women. So the women got nicked for loitering for the purpose, or soliciting for the purpose of prostitution. And the men were just, nothing happened to them. And it was always that kind of thing, well, hold on a minute, there's two people here. And if the men didn't drive round, you see what I mean? Or the women weren't on the streets. But it was very, very one-sided and very judgmental. And some of those women, my heart went out to them because they lived in abject poverty. It was just awful. And the only way that they could do something to get money for their kids or rent or anything was to work the streets. And I had a lot of time for them. I really did. And I never judged them. So in the process, I used to kind of inadvertently give me lots of information, but that wasn't the reason. Yeah. My reason was genuine. Absolutely genuine. I had a lot of time for them.
I do hope you enjoyed your bonus episode for this week of the festive season. I'll be back in your feed later this week with episode 140. Until then, thank you for your support, and I'll chat to you soon. A healthier, happier, more productive life starts with good sleep. Make sure you invest in the right bed. Dial-A-Bed stocks the best bed brands at the best prices. Shop at 76 stores nationwide or online.